Hello and welcome back to Practice Radio. In this episode, I speak to a gentleman called Trevor Johnson, who is currently the design director for one of the leading global healthcare communication agencies called Havas Lynx, who have offices in Manchester, London, and New York. But Trevor is probably best known for some of his work that he did in sort of the late 80s, early 90s that sort of helped shape the sort of Manchester scene in Manchester. So we did a lot of work with Factory Records, he did some album covers and all these different things, and we discussed that in the podcast. We also touch on sort of Trevor's early influences and what got him started in design and sort of his day-to-day working workflow that he has at Havas Lynx at the moment. But yeah, I hope you enjoy, and I'll let things play through. I started all the same. So for the people listening that aren't sort of familiar with your work and yourself, can you give them a bit of a rundown as to who you are and what you do?
Hi there, I'm Trevor Johnson. I've been a graphic designer based in Manchester, UK for over 50 years.
Yeah, jumping sort of backwards for yourself before everything began. Can you remember sort of what first got you started and interested into the world of sort of art and design?
Yeah, I was always drawing as a kid from as long ago as I can remember, and always top of art in school. But this was still well over 10 years before the first accessible commercial computers. So other than for practical things like lessons that we had, like technical drawing, graphic design wasn't a subject I knew anything about. I like looking at art in galleries, but was not massively keen on painting. And on reflections, more of into copying stuff, creating than creating comic book heroes and such. But was curious when I old enough to maybe find out if it was something you could possibly do for a living, art and visual representation.
Do you have any sort of go-to sort of people that you look up to in terms of inspiration for your own practice at all?
Yeah, yeah. I've been fortunate enough to have been involved in long enough to have had a number of key influences. Yeah, obviously I've the privilege of working with the people that was able to work with at Factory, Peter Saville and AVO and people like that. And before Factory, they were kind of influential individuals that I didn't realise were from Manchester and the north of England. Tony Forster, who was Jim would tell you about, as being kind of key typographic figure in typography, who became a good friend as well. So, yeah, there are, outside of graphic design, there are sort of influences that you take energy and reference from, like Andy Warhol and Duchamp and Pablo Picasso and those giants that you picked up on that changed and influenced the whole genre.
So, jumping forward, I understand you apprenticed for a commercial agency called ICA Publicity when you were 16. Can you just sort of touch on the sort of infant time in your career, and are there any sort of stand-up memories that will go on to shape who you will become almost?
Yeah, I was I was told about commercial art, which was the term for graphic design back in the day, because graphic design wasn't an occupation. So on leaving school, I wrote to practically all Manchester advertising agencies, and it eventually got some interviews and was taken on as an apprentice, by ICA, age 16 in 1973, based on the drawing skills and personality, hopefully. And that was the most exciting and thrilling experience, being in that environment. So pre-computers, the world of commercial art was totally craft-based. So I was introduced to specialist creatives in layout, illustration, lettering, photo retouching, and so on. And I instantly absolutely loved it, being in that environment. Most industries at that time were unionized back in the day. So I was indentured as an apprentice into the Society of Lithographic Artists, Designers and Engravers, SLAD, so Slade Union. So I can proudly boast, which I constantly do, that I was a member of Slade in the 70s. Some people will know what that means, some people won't.
I get it. I go. I'm in your age. I'm in the age bracket for it. It's not really a thing, is it? Unions anymore. They don't really do them as a thing.
I don't know if there is one in our industry anymore, but that was yeah, that was a necessity for all sort of practicing, artists and photographers. And I recently met up actually this year with a couple of them from that period that I haven't seen for decades. I just want to be able to say thank you to them for their influence and impact they had on my way of thinking and my career. So that was a nice thing to be able to take that full circle, really.
And you would then, so you do your apprenticeship. You would then sort of continue working for a few different agencies. Um, and then you would set up your own creative practice with with your partner, Tony Panas. Could you touch on sort of when you first started setting things up and were there any challenges and things? And is there maybe any advice you'd give to someone that was looking to start their own agency, sort of from what you know?
Yeah, I've never really stopped working. So I was employed as a senior designer visualizer for another agency by end of the 70s, early 80s, and responsible for seeing portfolios at the time. And Tony came in as a graduate sometime in the early 80s, and he had a terrific body of work, very much influenced by the then emerging talents of Peter Saville already, and was a big fan of the very early factory records, which on reflection wasn't what most agencies were looking for. But I just started doing some independent designs for local bands, and we understood each other and hit it off right away. He was a very likable and rebellious character in the right way. He'd been thrown out of Belfast College of Art before finishing his course. Well, I liked that energy and character about him, and his portfolio was fantastic. So we kept in touch. The independent commissions then sort of continued for me back from then on. And when I made the decision to want to try working for myself and going down that particular path, he was still unemployed and agreed to give it a go together. So we thought we'd have, sort of a good month's work. And we set up as partners sort of mid-80s. But it tended to be a really, really busy environment right from the start, with multiple projects overlapping continuously. So days were long and continuous. And with me being also, obviously directly involved in every aspect of the process and learning how to survive in the design business, having to run the business as well. Just do the design work. So yeah, that's how the setup with Tony came about. They really sort of entered into that whole culture with naivety and sort of no business sense whatsoever, really. It was just a case of have a go and see what happens and see what emerges from that. Things were happening in Manchester that allowed us to sort of operate, sort of cheap rent and sort of workflow. So it was just the idea of sort of learning as you went along, really, that was the most difficult bit, the business side of the design industry, really.
So yeah, from here you would obviously begin working sort of closely with factory records. And I'm sure you've been asked all these questions a million times by now, and I'm pretty sick of them. But for the people listening that maybe aren't familiar with that kind of body of work, could you touch on how this relationship sort of began forming?
Not as often as you may think, actually, no. So again, sort of early 80s, it was still, tech was in its infancy. It was very expensive and slow. So there was still no social media, certainly, So actual social interaction in Manchester was part of the culture and a sort of contributory factor in the process of attracting the majority of work that you're able to do, really, sort of word of mouth and seeing people and talking. Really good. So it was like in the post-punk early 80s. There was sort of a spirit of independence that came from that. Obviously, that gig that we all know about, the Sex Pistols. So a period of activity where socially as well, on the back of that, friends were forming bands and managing and promoting bands and running club nights and so on. So I'd naturally been asked to do flyers and posters and the odd record sleeve even at that time independently. So a portfolio of content of a sort began to evolve, so without being consciously, it's just a gathering of work. And I was doing promotional gig poster designs for a friend of mine who was managing a band who then signed to Factory. So they were happy to let me design the sleeve. And it just continued from there. You have to remember that Factory was formulated in the throes of punk and the do-it-yourself ethos, and very much subscribed to that before it actually evolved into whatever it became perceived as. Really, it was all, sort of down to Savile. So my first sleeve was in 1984. And Factory had already had its reputation established by Peter Savile for some time by then. And so once I'd made that connection, work was pretty much continuous for the next 8 to 9 years, and we just tried to do the very best we could in every instance. And it was a real pleasure and a privilege to be involved in contributing for so long, really, as a part of that group of activists.
So yeah, I read as I was doing sort of my research as I do with everyone, I read an interview you did last year. So yeah, you touched on a few different things in this interview, and you mentioned that you admire and envy those individuals who create and define a generation. And I thought that was kind of an interesting quote, as I think you were sort of a part of a group of people that sort of helped to define sort of a British canon almost. And you talk to people even now, and you ask sort of them their influences and things, and they still quote yourself, Designer's Republic and all that sort of area. Um, have you ever sort of got the chance to sort of reflect on that sort of thing? And is that sort of an idea that you agree with, sort of, or you know?
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. Thank you. But as sort of with any form of branding, graphic representation is intended to create a perception. It depends on the needs of the client and the intended audience as to the relationship of the graphics to the physical experience. So with Factory and the Hacienda, for instance, it was felt that a literal interpretation of what to expect from the music or the club wasn't always necessary, but more of a commitment to a standard of excellence in everything that they did. So their attitude became the identity, if you like, and that was what we sort of looked to maintain. We were just pleased it was happening in Manchester and to be able to keep going as much as anything. Well, looking back, there was such a fantastic variety and abundance of output for a period. It was bound to have some cultural resonance, and even if one didn't analyse it or appreciate it at the time, really.
The work from that period, and including your work, it sort of has a very timeless quality to it. There's things that you can look at now and you think it was made sort of yesterday, or very recently. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of the idea of something being timeless and why sort of that work from that period has lived, so much in infamy and sort of so long?
I think Factory's attitude to try and maintain absolute quality in everything they did, and the visual representation of that commitment stands up still. And if your influences and your references are of a certain type, whatever that is, that possibly filters through to the definitive visual output. So I think with the right attitude, considered visual solutions can stand the test of time, and some still look the part today. Still, I think.
Yeah. So it's just kind of a roll of a roll of a dice almost. Some of them you'll just get and they'll hit and sort of everything will sort of accumulate together into something which kind of stands the test.
I think if you use the right point of reference as an influence, not necessarily as a style to copy, but as whether that's consciously or subconsciously, then that permeates into the things that you're doing for other people, and sometimes time determines how simple something looks, and as you know, and how much money somebody's got. But so the whole, but we've always designed with a lot of longevity in mind. Just the fact that something might just last longer than for the purpose it was created. So if a flyer is for a fortnight or a month, you know, naturally people down the line, humans get obsessed with those things and want to collect them and reference them in 10 or 20 years time. So you kind of, you half if you have the time, just with that in mind, you think that, if you've got the time, make it just a bit nicer, and it did, kind of influence somebody else to commission you to do another piece of work as well.
So yeah, this is kind of the midpoint of the show that I call the Hall of Fame, which is sort of ripping off Desert Aladis, but not, but at the same time it is. And it's just sort of the idea that if you could choose one piece, sort of that's inspired and been sort of the heartbeat of your own career, be it kind of a person, piece of art, piece of music, an experience, whatever you could think of, what do you think that would be for yourself?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's been many and varied, but for me, probably growing up in industrial Salford, and working and socializing in Manchester, really, that has been sort of the thing that sort of keeps coming into the influences that contribute to some of the things that we do. I do feel very privileged to have been party to, or at the right age and in the right place to experience some of the cultural shifts that I have in the times that I have. And Manchester historically has always been about creative mavericks who do things that change the world. They sort of book the trend and change the world in all sorts of cultures, really. So hopefully that will continue. And in Manchester specifically, creative thinking, hopefully is still part of the fibre of the city. So I expect more things to continue happen here.
What I wanted to ask was, why do you think Manchester is Manchester? Kind of, there's been other towns that have had kind of, and cities that have had kind of the same kind of industrial feel, like Stoke. I'm from Stoke. We've had all the pottery stuff, and then we've kind of died a death after that. It's not gone anywhere. It's still sort of stuck in that time period. Where Manchester's sort of come on. Even from then, they've gone into the music scene, into the sports scene, and then kind of climbed up the ladder from there. And even now, are kind of still pushing boundaries in different areas, and doing all different things. But what do you think? Why is it? Why are they an anomaly? Almost, it feels like.
Well, there's volumes of books on the stuff, but I think there's this spirit of independence, I think that's come from centuries of activity. We don't have to be, there's a difference between international capital cities and regional cultural cities, and they don't have to be comparable. Washington's different to New York, and Barcelona's different to Madrid, and so on. So you can have your own culture and sort of energy in that, and and only I mean, you don't always notice that once if you're part of that. It's only when you step out of that for a while and sort of reflect on it, then you realise that there's quite a thing. There's quite something to be proud of, influenced by that. So I don't know what it is about that. It's just that thing about Mavericks. Really, Maverick genius has always been part of throughout history. If Epping Pankhurst and Alan Turing, and there's many different sorts of characters you want to look at. It's where they kind of go against the grain and put the trend and make a difference. So hopefully that the city's changing physically on a huge scale at the moment. So hopefully that will still remain, that sort of core value for the city.
So yeah, jumping forward, you would continue working in industry, and in 2007 you would begin working at an agency you still work for now called Havas Lynx. Could you touch on how design has sort of changed sort of from then till now a little bit?
Well, a few generations have evolved now using just tech, and sort of technological evolution brings with it new skills and jobs. But with that, it creates its own and continually new problems. And sometimes what appears to be frustratingly simple things to resolve, which we would have done manually back in the day, seem unnecessarily complicated. And because of that, procedures working in certain programs. There also seems to be a sort of sense of complacency with technology that maybe didn't exist so much in the past. The fact that everything is accessible, so therefore disposable, and requirements and solutions are maybe not always evaluated logically, if that makes sense. It's hard one. I do try and look at the bigger picture, and the evolution of the planet, and communication will sort of continue to evolve and change and get more diverse. And we are just a blip in that whole process. So there's no point in dwelling on it too long. You just have to keep going. Really, I'll try and keep going. Havas, the company, works with other companies that can have a global impact with their products in the pharmaceutical industry, for instance. But in some of those industries, any change to the norm can have a considerable impact. So therefore doesn't tend to happen that often. And ironically, from my experiences with providing graphic design for fashion and clothing industry, I found that in some instances, clients were actually paranoid about trying something they hadn't experienced before. They were completely comfortable in plundering retrospective references, but would only follow what was already accepted rather than try something new, which was sort of different to the things we'd done before in music. So hopefully the process of handcrafting letterforms or applying illustrative decoration is centuries old and currently still in demand, it seems. So fortunately, I still have the opportunity to still do things by hand on a regular basis in terms of handcrafting type and things like that. And however advanced we've become technologically, I can't see that changing in my lifetime, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. So there'll always be kind of a love of craft almost inbuilt in kind of almost the world, I guess.
Oh, I would hope so. But things as are sort of changing on a daily basis. They're so rapidly, aren't they? And that process of uh, processing information is so fast that there's been always time to stop and nurture that and sort of style it in any way. It's just kind of in and out on a
Sort of again touching on sort of how you work at Havas Lynx, could you touch on kind of I don't need like an itinerary as to say I wake up at this time, I have breakfast at this time, but could you touch on sort of what kind of a work day looks like for yourself currently?
Yeah, I really don't know what normal is yet post-COVID. I've not got back into any sort of landscape of understandable activity, but agency-wise, the company is over 500 strong, and so that's mainly for me troubleshooting either tech problems like this morning, all morning, or resolving traditional print and production equations for those with less or little experience. So that's interesting. I've sort of stepped back from independent commissions as well after 6 decades of doing things for other people to try and focus on documenting some of the old stuff better. Because, as I say, it's sort of been 50 years. So factory was 8 or 9, 10 years in that. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that is maybe not as often profiled that I think is interesting to look at as well, because it has the same commitment and attitude to some of those things. And I've just got a few collaborative, in saying that, a few collaborative arrangements where my experience in craft is more valued. And so I've got a number of projects underway currently, such as a couple of logos for independent businesses, a quarterly 60-page magazine for Manchester Independent Gallery and Bookshop, a local community arts project, I think a charity activity, still doing some music design for a couple of factory bands, amongst other things. And the hacienda thing is always a constant. It crops up every week or every month, in and interviews, of course. So the correspondence and communication that goes with all of those things sort of take up most of whatever time I'm allowed.
So yeah, I ask this to people normally as well, which is the idea of Just when you're looking at student portfolios, I assume you've looked at a lot of different students. Were you a teacher at one point? Were you a lecturer?
I've always had long-standing associations with all regional colleges and more importantly connections to the people that run the courses. So get an idea of what's coming through. And I've managed courses, yeah, back in the day, but occasionally just do talks and workshops these days more than anything. But in terms of students' work, you expect all students to have sort of basic understanding of the course that they're on. But no one will be fully prepared for a career in any industry with just a couple of years of basic training. So what any potential employee will be looking for, I think, are those core skills, obviously, but personality as much as anything, enthusiasm, willingness to learn, communication capabilities. Communication is the single biggest skill in any industry, really, and the means to communicate and the ability to communicate properly with your colleagues, with subcontractors, with clients and stuff is something that you do or have to learn, whether you're good at those things or not. So all of that has to be molded and directed in the right manner for whatever the practice of that company is, really. So they'll look for personality and enthusiasm.
I think a lot of people have echoed the same thoughts when I've asked them where it's kind of just if you're a bit of a dickhead, you're a bit of a dickhead, and you don't really want to work with dickheads, do you? So it's kind of doesn't matter how good your work is, so it's just going to be the same.
Yeah, there's sort of a way you behave professionally as well that becomes, we've often been asked by design, so we have this junior, midweight, senior design, and once you get to a senior point, where do you go from there? What else can you learn? But what you're actually doing is sort of taking on board the pattern of behaviour and a way of that's professionally that's sort of maybe different to the way you behave outside. That does then influence the younger generation coming through. So you sort of keep, you keep sort of taking those things on board all the time and keep learning all the time. And, that sort of character, which was kind of one of the things going right back to that being a junior at 16 was one of the big impacts on me that I've always remembered, the way some of those big personalities behaved, back in the day, back in the studio, that I try and respect and represent to this day.
Yeah, so sort of beginning to round off, and I sort of ask all my guests the same question at the end, and it's kind of cliche and a bit cheesy, but if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice when you first got started, knowing what you know now, what would that be?
Well, yeah, from my own experiences, so be brave, confident, take risks and go for it. Life's too short. The hindsight's marvelous, obviously, isn't it? But if there's one positive thing to take from that COVID and lockdown, it was time to reevaluate actually what was actually really important, and because we had the time to sort of rethink in real time. And however troubled this world is, it's a wonderful time to be alive. There've never been more possibilities and opportunities to achieve goals than exist today. So I'd probably say, knowing how incredibly fleeting our existence is on this fragile planet, I'd say always respect and appreciate your privileges. We're in a very privileged generation and culture. Take nothing for granted and focus on the positives. Try and focus on the positives all the time. And be kind and trust your faith. You can't change the past. You can only affect the future.
That's a lovely note. That's a lovely note. So yeah, and then super lastly, um, is there anywhere people can find yourself online? And I guess if not, is there anywhere you'd point people towards if they wanted to look at your work, sort of your body of work or anything like that?
Other than Googling, currently not. Um, for me, it's a who and what for equation. That so since the early days, I've never needed a portfolio, not digital or otherwise, to generate work. So never had one. But because of the nature of the representation of some of the projects I was involved in over the last 6 decades, I get asked continually to do talks, interviews, and contribute to exhibitions and such. And so it would be useful to have an online single point of reference as a sort of chronological visual diary of the decades. So I actually started a website during lockdown. There've been occasions over the years where I've seen copies in the public domain and poor interpretations of the designs that we did back in the day. So working towards that idea of establishing ownership and giving an authentic and definitive representation versions of the original. So I'm hoping to prioritize that this year as a personal goal. But as I said, tech skills are limited, so that might take a bit longer than planned. But that's the ambition, to get something out there that's just enough definitive.
No, that'll be class just to kind of go to and look at. I think I personally really enjoy that, just be able to go in and sort of have a nosy and stuff. But yeah, that's it. Hello again. I hope you enjoyed that. As ever, my website is paritymaterial.co.uk. Parity Material everywhere you want to find me. And yeah, I've done a few recently, haven't I? So hope you enjoyed them. Hope you enjoyed this one. And yeah, hopefully more to come in the future. So I'll speak at you next time.